Hello everyone and welcome to our 7.5 notes on kites. And so many of you are familiar with kites and many of you have flown a kite before, but what is the geometric definition of a kite? A kite is going to be a type of quadrilateral, so remember we're talking about figures that have four sides whenever we talk about a quadrilateral, with exactly two pairs of congruent consecutive sides. We're going to unpack that in a minute. Two pairs of congruent consecutive sides, but there's no parallel sides. So here's what this means. These two are consecutive, and those two lengths are going to be the same. And then these two longer ones are congruent, and those are consecutive to each other as well. So two pairs of congruent consecutive sides, the purple being one pair, the green being another pair. And so what are some of the properties we know about a kite? Well, if you've ever built a kite, you know that whenever you build the frame, that those diagonals are going to be perpendicular to each other. So BD is one diagonal. It is going to be perpendicular to AC, meaning that I get to put four right angles. There's already one listed here, but I get to put four right angles around these two diagonals. They're going to be perpendicular to each other. They're going to be crossing each other at 90 degrees. So our diagonals are going to be perpendicular in a kite every single time. That is also the case for a rhombus, and so this is going to be true of a kite. Okay? What do we know about the angles between the non-congruent sides? Those are going to be congruent. So here's what that means. Between the purple and the yellow, these two angles, angle B and angle D, are going to be congruent. You can kind of see this if you take this triangle that's on the top. So I'm gonna do this in a color. If I take this triangle that's on the top, BAC, that triangle is going to be congruent and fold directly on top of, if I were to fold it down, triangle A to D to C. And so those angles would wind up lining on top of each other. And so angle B is going to be congruent to angle D. So I'm going to write that here. Angle B is going to be congruent to angle D. Those are between the non-congruent sides. And then what do we know about this long diagonal? What does the long diagonal do? The long diagonal is going to bisect the angles and the short diagonal. So this short diagonal gets bisected. So B to E, 1, 2, 3, is going to be the same length as E to D, 1, 2, 3. So this long diagonal in purple bisects the short diagonal. It also bisects the opposite angles. So this angle gets bisected into two congruent angles, and then this angle gets bisected into two congruent angles. So I'm going to put two arcs here to show that those are congruent, and then three arcs here to show that these are congruent. So these are just congruent triangles. Heart would fold on top of heart. The yellow one would fold on top of the yellow one and be congruent. The star would fold on top of the star. These triangles are congruent by side, angle, side, or you could say side, side, side. A huge amount of reasons. We could probably say all the reasons on this, but these two triangles are congruent, meaning this top triangle in red, this top triangle is going to be congruent to this bottom triangle in, I'll do a different color, in green. So those two triangles are going to be congruent to each other, as well as the more individual, smaller right triangles. This pink triangle is going to be congruent to this pink triangle, the small ones at the top. And then this blue triangle is going to be congruent to this right angle blue triangle. So you can see all the pieces that are going to be congruent to each other. All right, so solve for the indicated values of each kite. So the first thing I want us to do is to always go ahead and mark our diagonals and go ahead and mark that they're perpendicular to each other. Because if I do that, this is going to be a little bit easier to draw in this picture. These two blue right triangles are going to be congruent to each other at the top, the smaller blue ones. And then the bigger right triangles at the bottom, the left and the right, are going to be congruent to each other as well. If you know that, if we can break this down into triangles, we are so used to doing all of the congruence statements from congruent triangles that this will be much easier if you can break this down into triangles. So these two blue right triangles at the top are congruent, and the two pink right triangles at the bottom are congruent. So we're going to solve for the measure of angle 1. Well, what's the measure of angle 1? By definition, or by the properties of a kite, we know that angle 1 is going to be 90 degrees because those diagonals are going to be perpendicular. All right, if this one over here is 40, I get to copy it to over here. This is also going to be 40. And then working with this little triangle at the top, this right triangle has a sum of 180 degrees. So 180 minus 90 minus 40 is going to give me 50 degrees for angle 2. So I'd be able to copy a 50 here as well as here, 50 degrees and 50 degrees. Okay. All right, let's do that exact same thing. So I'm gonna grab my diagonals. There's my diagonals. I'm gonna go ahead and put right angles around them because they're perpendicular to each other. And then that's gonna break it down into these two smaller right triangles that are in yellow, and then the bigger right triangles that are in blue. Okay. All right, how do we find the measure of angle 1? The measure of angle 1 is just gonna be 90 degrees because that's a right angle. Those are perpendicular to each other. If this little piece is 36 and this little yellow right triangle, that means that the other side is also going to be 36 because that long diagonal is going to bisect that angle. And so how do I find angle 2? It's going to be 180 degrees minus 36 minus 90. 180 minus 36 minus 90 is going to give me 54 degrees for angle 2, and I could also copy that here, 54 degrees, since those yellow triangles are congruent. So that angle 2 is 54 degrees, and then we said that angle 3 was 36 degrees. All right, this one does not have any diagonals drawn in. You could draw them in if you wanted to, but I do remember that this shape is a quadrilateral. And so for a quadrilateral, what is the interior angle sum of a quadrilateral? 360 degrees. And I do know that by the properties of a kite, this yellow angle, angle 1, is going to be congruent to 110 degrees because that is going to be the angle that is in between the non-congruent sides, meaning that this has 1 tick mark and then this has 2. So same thing on this one. The purple and the green is 1 tick mark versus 2, and so the angles in between those two are said to be congruent to each other. So I can say that angle 1 is going to be equal to 110 degrees. So angle 1 was 110. So if we want to find angle 2, well, angle 2 is going to be once I fill this in as 110, that is going to be the 4th angle, and we already know all of the other ones. So what is 360 minus 110 minus 110 again minus 98? What is left for that last angle? That is going to give me 42 degrees. So that top angle is going to be obtuse in this kite. That bottom angle is going to be acute, 42 degrees. If I drew in a diagonal, I don't have to, but if I did draw in a diagonal, that would break each of these little pieces down to 21 and 21, and then each of these little pieces into 49 and 49. So I could always create that if I needed to. All right, so I see the diagonals drawn in. I'm going to go ahead and put my right angles here. This creates the congruent triangle. So here's my little right triangle. This yellow one is congruent to this yellow one. And then this blue one is congruent to this blue one. All right, so what is angle 3? Immediately I know that angle 3 is going to be a 90-degree angle because the diagonals are perpendicular in a kite. Okay, what else can I do? Let's see. Let's go ahead and sort through it. So let's get started. This one is 52. That means that angle 7 is also going to be 52 degrees. So angle 7, it doesn't ask us for that in the list, but angle 7 would be 52. Why does that help me? Because now I can find angle 6. Angle 6 is going to be 180 minus 90 minus 52. When I do that 180 minus 90 minus 52, that's going to give me 38 degrees for angle 6. If that is 38 degrees, then this congruent angle is also going to be 38 degrees. So angle 5 is 38 as well. All right, so then we have this 65-degree angle in blue right here. So that is also going to be angle 4 is going to be 65 degrees. Why does that help me find this last one? Because this last one is going to be this square is going to be 180 minus 90 minus 65. What is 180 minus 90 minus 65? That gives me a 25-degree angle here. And so if angle 1 is 25 degrees, angle 2 is also going to be 25 degrees. So that's using the yellow right angles and then the blue right angles, or the yellow right triangles and the blue right triangles. All right, let's do this again. We've got our diagonals are going to be perpendicular to each other, which creates my right triangles that are congruent. Here's my blue ones, the bigger ones on the bottom. Okay, and then here are my yellow ones on the top. And what we are given is we are given 3x plus 6 is that angle that is pointing just to part of this, so just to this half right here. And then we are given the 2x plus 6, which is pointing to just this bottom part. So if I were looking at this triangle right here, I don't know this missing piece, so I would not be able to use the triangle angle sum theorem there. But if I'm looking at just this blue right triangle, I do know an expression for all three pieces. When I say an expression, I can add up, this is 90. I can create an equation and say, okay, well then 90 plus 4x plus 2x plus 6 should have a sum of 180 degrees. So I'm going to combine my like terms. So all three of those angles added up to 180. And so we're going to get 6x equals 84. And so x is going to be 14. And that's all they wanted me to solve for. X is 14. So we actually did not need that yellow angle at all. All right. Okay, we know that this one diagonal actually is going to create two congruent triangles here, this yellow one as well as this yellow one. Those are going to be congruent to each other. And I know that this 2y that's in between these non-congruent sides is going to be congruent to this angle, which is in between the other two non-congruent sides. So I know that 2y is going to be equal to 17x plus 1. Sadly, that does not allow me to solve for either variable, so I'm going to have to approach it differently. So let's go look where there's more variables. This is 17x plus 1. This is 3x plus 1. So what do I know about the angles in the triangle that is on the right side with the 38? All three of those should have a sum of 180. So let's create an equation that only has an x in it. 3x plus 1 plus 38 equals 180. And so I can combine some like terms. So that becomes 20x plus 40 equals 180. So we get 20x equals 140. And so x is going to have, when I solve for x, I'm going to get 7. Why does that help me find y? Because now I can plug in a 7 here. It's going to be 17 times 7 plus 1. So now we're going to know that 2y is going to be equal to, let's see, 2y equals 120. So y is going to have a value of 60. Y must be 60. All right, you can see how we're turning the kites all kinds of ways on y'all just to make sure that you know which one is the long diagonal, which one is the short diagonal. So the long diagonal is going to be this one. I know that because the short diagonal is going to fall in between the two non-congruent sides. So that's going to be this one and this one. So those two blue angles are going to be congruent to each other. And so I'm immediately able to set 5x minus 15 equal to 4x plus 13. So I end up getting x equals 28, I believe. X is 28. Okay? So there's x. Now I just need to solve for y. So where is a y pointing to? This is y minus 9. So that's also going to be on this side. I can copy that to here. This is also going to be y minus 9. Okay, where else do I see a y? Well, here's a y, and then here's an x. But what I can do is I can plug in the x that I found right here to actually solve what this angle is. So what is 5 times 28? And that's going to be minus 15. I believe that that gives me 125 for this angle. Why does that help me? Because I can take the three angles in this triangle. It'd be the same thing as if I went to the above one. And I can add those up, all three of those up, to 180 degrees. So y minus 9 plus 125 plus y equals 180. That is 2y plus 1. Let's see, I'm combining like terms. Did I miss anything? I did not. So 2y plus 116, I believe, equals 180. So then 2y equals 64. So y has a value of 32. So I had to plug in y before plug in x before I solved for y. I had to solve for x first. Okay. Now the kite is back to right side up, like you would imagine if you're flying it. There's the angle between the two non-congruent sides that are congruent to each other. So immediately I can set 2y plus 60 equal to 4y. So I get 60 equals 2y. So y is going to be equal to 30. If y is 30, then both of those angles are congruent. And then x is pointing to this side length. Who is that congruent to? That's going to be congruent to this longer side length as well. So then 3x minus 7 is going to be equal to x plus 7. I'm going to get my variables on the same side, and I'm going to solve for x. So x must be 7. If this is a kite, then the properties of a kite say that those two sides are going to be congruent to each other. All right, last problem. Immediately put your right angles around the diagonals being perpendicular to each other. That is going to, we're going to solve for x. And so there's a bunch of different x's here. You just have to know which pieces are congruent. So here's my short diagonal, meaning that this side, a to b, is going to have to be congruent to x minus 1. Those two yellows are congruent. And then these two purples are going to be congruent, the longer side and the longer side. So it does not matter which set I use, the yellow or the purple, but I either need to set a yellow equal to a yellow or a purple equal to a purple. So I'm going to choose to do the 2x minus 5 equal to x minus 1 because that's less work. It doesn't have a distributive property in it. So that would be x equals 4. But I do want to show you, even if you had chosen the purple pieces, x plus 4 and 4 times x minus 2, we would still have gotten the same thing. So that'd be x plus 4 equals 4x minus 8, and we'd get 3x equals 12, so x would still be equal to 4. You just had to know which pieces were congruent, which sides were congruent in the kite. So the next page is the practice. I did give you a section to fully mark all of the properties of the kite below before you get started, just to think through it. And then there are 8 questions to practice. I hope you're having a fabulous day.